Welcome to the third session of Theology Under Quarantine. I'm glad that you've made it this far. So over the last few weeks, 2 weeks ago, we looked at distancing and disorientation. I talked some about the seasons of life and how to think about this season of disorientation that we're all experiencing right now. Then last week, we talked about pandemics and providence. And I argued that God is present in the midst of the pandemic, but God is not in control. That divine power doesn't work like magic, controlling everything, but works more like music, influencing everything in more subtle ways. Some of you found that helpful. Some of you found that disturbing. That's okay. There's room for all of us here. So today we're talking about coronavirus and church. And my question really is pretty simple. Can we be church in the midst of the coronavirus pandemic? As you may know, it's hard to get a straight answer out of a theologian, so it may not surprise you that my answer to that question is yes and no. So first thing I want to do is just acknowledge what's happening here. The church is evolving and changing in amazing ways right before our eyes. How many congregations have, for the very first time, jumped into live streaming and virtual services and social media just over the last few weeks? You could even argue that in some ways the church has evolved and changed more quickly over the past month than it has in whole decades before now. I'm not really going to argue that point, but I think it's interesting to think about. So I do want to affirm the creativity of all my colleagues and all those who are reinventing what it means to be church in a time of social distancing. This is no easy task, and none of us went to school for this sort of thing. I also want to affirm how amazingly fortunate we are to have access to all this technology, all these ways of connecting with one another virtually. This is a great gift, and I think we should all recognize how fortunate we are. So for our question, can we be church in the midst of the coronavirus pandemic? Well, my first answer is yes. In fact, I'd argue there's something good about congregations being shut down for a while. Now, I know that's a really strange thing to say, but here's what I mean. I believe that what we're doing when we gather together as congregations is practicing what it means to live out faith in the world. So all the things we do, when we worship together, we're practicing seeing God through music and stories so that we can see God everywhere in the world. When we baptize infants, we're practicing caring for this particular child so that we can care for all the children that we come into contact with. When we practice communion, we're practicing sharing our table, sharing our food, being reconciled to one another, so that we can do that at all the other tables of the world. As we serve others through the church, we're practicing generosity, practicing compassion, so that we will continue to do those things, generosity and compassion, beyond the church. And as we care for one another, as we love one another, we're, at least on our better days, we're practicing loving each other so that we can go out and love our neighbors and even love our enemies. So you see what I'm saying? Our life together as a congregation is in part practicing what it means to live out faith in the world. In some ways, it's all been a dress rehearsal for this moment. Now we're called to live out all the stuff we've been preaching these past years. So I have this interesting idea, I think. Maybe the church was always intended to go out of business. I think we see a hint of that in Revelation 21. I mentioned Revelation 21 last week. I want to look there one more time. It's very near the end of the Bible. This is the end of chapter 21. I saw no temple in the city. This is the holy city. For its temple is the Lord God, the Almighty, and the Lamb. And the city has no need of sun or moon to shine on it, for the glory of God is its light, and its lamp is the Lamb. The nations will walk by its light, and the kings of the earth will bring their glory into it. Its gates will never be shut by day, and there will be no night there. Did you notice the first line? I saw no temple in the city. There's no temple. It's like the temple was always meant to be a temporary dwelling, a place for people to learn to bear the divine light. But then once all creation can bear it, there's no more need for the temple. So what do you think? Maybe the church was always intended to go out of business. But let me be really clear here. Obviously, we're not there yet. This is only a temporary shutdown, and we have a lot more work to do as congregation. We have a lot more to learn. So I'm not suggesting that it's time for the church to close up shop. But still, I think there is some good to congregations being closed. It's an opportunity to practice what we've been preaching. So, can we be church in the midst of coronavirus? Yes. And maybe in some ways we can do it now more than ever. But there is another sense in which we really can't be church in the midst of coronavirus, at least not fully, not completely, despite all our amazing creativity and all this technological savvy. We are still missing something crucial. One of the great challenges that the Christian tradition has wrestled with from the very beginning is this idea of dualism. It has a lot of other names, but dualism will do for now. Dualism basically is the idea that we as human beings are made up of two different kinds of things, a body and a soul. And where this idea really goes off the rails is when it affirms that the soul is somehow greater than the body, that the soul is more important than the body, and so the body can be neglected or even left behind. At its worst, dualism has even said that the body is somehow inherently sinful or dirty or corrupt. Now, I know this may seem like an obscure idea, but the implications of this idea have been with us for since the very beginning, and many of the problems that we're dealing with still today find their roots in this idea of dualism. I'm going to give you just some examples. The denigration of the flesh, people mistreating their bodies in the name of spiritual enlightenment. Colonialism and slavery both were animated by the idea that we can enslave people's bodies in order to save their souls. The role of women, for a variety of reasons, really this could be its own theology under quarantine. Women were traditionally associated more with the body, while men were associated more with the soul, which was one element in the oppression of women. What about sexuality? The Christian tradition has been all tangled up about sexuality from the very beginning, in part because of the ways the body is associated with sin and corruption. And then care for the earth. This also comes out of this tendency towards dualism, as a tendency to neglect caring for the earth. If what really matters about us is our non-material soul, then who cares about the material world? All of these really destructive tendencies spin out, at least in part, from dualism, from the idea that the body is somehow less important than the soul. At its best, Christianity affirms the opposite of that. It affirms that bodies matter. Matter matters. One of the most central claims of the Christian faith is that bodies and flesh and matter are important and are loved by God. That's actually the centerpiece of one of our most important stories, the Christmas story, right? The whole doctrine of the incarnation says that God took on flesh. However we interpret that claim, it affirms that flesh is a fitting habitation for the divine life. God's love for the world includes bodies, and so must ours. You cannot love someone's soul to the neglect of their body. You can't love someone without feeding them and clothing them and caring for them physically. Bodies matter. Matter matters. So this is where I want to caution us as the church in the midst of coronavirus. Virtual communion can be a beautiful thing. I'm recording this on a Thursday, Maundy Thursday. probably all throughout the world on this very day, people will be celebrating virtual communion. That's a beautiful thing, and we are so grateful to have the capacity to do that. But it is incomplete because we're not in the same space. We're not breathing the same air. We don't have the same ground beneath our feet. We're not in our bodies together. So the communion that we're celebrating virtually is beautiful, but incomplete. Same thing with our virtual worship practices. I'm so grateful that we can do this, but it is incomplete. The church, at its best, holds on to this ancient idea that our bodies really matter, that ultimately human beings need to breathe together, that as amazing as our virtual existence may be, there's something missing from it. So I want to call this the divine conspiracy. You know, the word conspiracy actually means to breathe together. You have to be in the same space to do that. I said in my last Theology Under Quarantine that God's power, God is like music. Well, if God is like music, then that makes the church sort of like a choir. And while all sorts of virtual ways of making music are possible, there's nothing like being in the same space, being bodies together, making music together, breathing together. So, can we be church in the midst of coronavirus? In so many ways, the answer is yes. We can practice what we've been preaching. We can care for one another. We can care for the world. We can listen for the divine music in all things. But can we be church in the midst of coronavirus? In at least one way, the answer is no, because in at least one way, it's incomplete. Because we can't be bodies together. We can't make music together. We can't breathe together. We need to keep alive the hope that someday soon we can participate in the divine conspiracy together, breathing together once again. So I hope this has given you some things to think about. Don't hesitate to reach out to me if you have questions or comments. Again, Theology Under Quarantine, Session 3. Glad you were with us today. Take care.